when I was the head coach in high school and I started to get my kids a little bit more committed to goals and things they really wanted to achieve and get them the idea of how that happens, I encourage them to spend some time outside of the 3 months of the season to get better. You know, it depended on what they wanted. Well, what do you want? Well, I want to be a state level gymnast. I want to be a state level gymnastics team. Okay, if this is what you want, this is the path you go. My question is there a better way? And so that's where I come from, because I would prefer, as a coach, as a person, and as a parent, for my athletes, for my kids to be intrinsically motivated. So I want to put in those kind of efforts like they did because I want to do that, not because you're making me do that. Okay, well, I agree wholeheartedly with the three that you gave. It was do no harm. The second one was
do your best.
Do your best. And the third?
Be honest.
Okay, and then you talked about being kind. And there are other things that kind of play into that. And the reason I say that is because it kind of goes into my style of coaching, which had a lot to do with emphasizing character, which goes right into that whole piece that you talked about, all three of those, and actually everything you mentioned. The one thing that can be difficult at times for people to understand is that first one, do no harm. Because as you start to walk that level of excellence, depending on what level, you know, when you're starting to talk about national caliber, Olympic caliber, professional caliber athletes, there tends to be a fine line of how hard to push that body to get to that point. In fact, there's a lot of discussion about that in the gymnastics world right now, is where do you draw the line where abuse occurs, physical abuse on your body, and everybody's different. You know, what I can handle physically may be a little different than what my next door neighbor can handle physically. So it's a tough thing to walk when you start to go up that ladder.
You want to test your philosophy before you release your book. You know, you want to ask the experts. And so that's why I reached out to a gentleman today who's got more than 35 years in of educating athletes, mainly young athletes. And that's very helpful to me. And he also was a junior athlete, a world-class junior athlete himself in gymnastics. So what a pleasure it's going to be for us to hear from Kirk Mango in Naperville, Illinois, which is about 50 miles west of Chicago. And it's in the 60s today, so that's good news in a May that had some cold weather just a few days ago. So Kirk, say hello and tell us what's going on in your life before we go into a bit about your background.
Oh, hi, Sifu. Well, kind of stay at home right now, right? Everybody has those rules, so I'm not doing a lot. Maybe a lot of reading, and you know, I'm into cooking a little bit too. So there's not a lot going on right now.
So you're on the quarantine, but you and your wife play some hardcore ping pong, from what I hear.
Yeah, it's just something that she did a lot when she was younger, and I played a lot of tennis. In fact, that was actually my second sport. I didn't play like at the collegiate or high school level because I was a gymnast, and that's pretty much all I did. But I did play traveling when I got done with college, and I like that. And table tennis kind of goes along with that.
Fantastic. So becoming a true champion for life, tell us what that's about.
Well, it actually came about the impetus for that through a conversation I had with a bunch of parents after a competition that my oldest daughter was in soccer. both my kids were competitive athletes, and she must have been about 11 or 12. And I was sitting around a table with a group of parents regarding what they thought was being done incorrectly that would help the kids become more successful. And what I found really interesting in that conversation was, and I just sat and listened for 20 minutes, because everything that came out of their discussion centered on everything outside the athlete, which was completely opposite of my experience as a competitive athlete at the level I competed at. And, you know, I asked a couple of questions, and I remember leaving that conversation and getting in the car and saying to my wife, you know, I should write a book. This is just so opposite of what I learned as an athlete. It's just, if you'll excuse the expression, kind of ass backwards. So that was the motivation. And the idea was to give athletes the information that they need when they're in that experience, not after looking back. So since I was in that position of hindsight, being able to look back at my career and be able to look at my daughter's athletic experiences and what they were going through and all that I had learned. So that was the book was about, to give them information that they can use when they need it instead of after, and give them the opportunity to reach the potential that I see and have seen in many kids throughout my life.
So a true champion for life, I was trying to think about that word before our interview today. And I thought for life, you could say there's the game of life. So you've got different games that you're playing in the scholastic world and in the work world, family world. If you look at it as a game, there's all these different pieces, and there's got to be some cohesion. Of course, there's going to be some chaos from time to time, but you let that explode and then you rein it back in. A few years ago, I came up with this idea for everybody trying to get grounded, you know, the East-West philosophy and yoga. And I said, one of the reasons I just came up with is that if you're a bottle rocket and you light the bottle rocket, it presses off the ground. So there was grounding, it presses off the ground, and then it shoots into the air out of the bottle and it explodes. And then it can come back down to the earth and be grounded again. So I think if people aren't doing what you're doing with these ping pong matches with your wife and your daily fitness and letting out the steam on a daily basis, how are you going to get grounded? It's almost like you're forcing yourself to get grounded when you haven't done the explosion and the catharsis yet. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, Sifo, I like the analogy you used. Another story I would give you real quick that kind of relates a little bit to that. I remember having a pretty confrontational, maybe a little confrontational conversation with a club coach in gymnastics where I taught outside the school. And it centered on the idea, we didn't use the word grounding, but I used the terminology. Well, I asked him, why does he coach? And his comment to me was, well, I coach gymnastics for everybody to be a good or great gymnast. I want to have great gymnasts. And I said, well, what about life, right? Which is what you're talking about. And he said, well, my hope is that they learn stuff about life. And I said, well, I kind of look at it from a different perspective. My perspective is I use gymnastics, or any sport really, as a tool to teach kids about life. So that kind of connects with the grounding you're talking about. So it didn't matter really what I coached, even though I was head coach of gymnastics, I coached volleyball. To me, that was a tool to teach kids about success and in life. And so we actually never saw eye to eye on that. I mean, that's his view. That was my view, and that's okay.
Were you co-coaching?
I was actually, when I was the head coach in high school, and I started to get my kids a little bit more committed to goals and things they really wanted to achieve and get them the idea of how that happens. I encourage them to spend some time outside of the 3 months of the season to get better. You know, it depended on what they wanted. Well, what do you want? Well, I want to be a state level gymnast. I want to be a state level gymnastics team. Okay, if this is what you want, this is the path you go. And I worked there coaching my athletes in the summer. So I coached them kind of there. They had the facilities are unmatched. You can't get a high school gym with the facilities that they have at a club. You just can't. So that's kind of how that relationship came about.
Got it. So, you know, this winning game of life, I came up with a couple of points, and feel free to add on any after you hear my short list. Do no harm. And so that's your body. That's the league that you're in, the honoring the sport and its heritage, doing no harm to yourself, etc. do your best, be honest. And I think those three things, you know, as you're a developing youth, you start to understand what that is. You know, you may start out stepping on insects, but eventually you're going to realize that's not the way to roll. And some people may at age 4 say, hey, that's not a good thing. So you got do no harm, do your best, be honest, be kind, generate smiles, which I think a lot of the seriousness in athletics forgets from time to time with these rivalries and the self-improvement and the coach, maybe a little fear of the coach. And then how do we get there? You know, considering that question, how do we get there on a regular basis? So in the coaching of the youth athlete, and I'm 57 now, I still reach out to coaches all the time for life issues, for health issues, you know, a chiropractor, physical therapist, massage therapist. They're my coaches for what they do. So we have this program, and I think you have to work on integrity. You have to work on self-improvement on a regular basis. And since I'm in the world of boyfriend, girlfriend, I know that if somebody is not working on self-improvement, or they don't tell me, hey, right now I can't do that because I'm in a crisis or I'm behind on something, but I'm ready to go at that self-improvement as soon as I mop this up. As long as they have that intention and that wish for self-improvement and work on it to the best of their ability, I know we've got a really good chance of having a great relationship. Your turn.
Okay, well, I agree wholeheartedly with the three that you gave. It was do no harm. The second one was
do your best.
Do your best. And the third?
Be honest.
Okay, and then you talked about being kind, and there are other things that kind of play into that. And the reason I say that is because it kind of goes into my style of coaching, which had a lot to do with emphasizing character, which goes right into that whole piece that you talked about, all three of those, and actually everything you mentioned. The one thing that can be difficult at times for people to understand is that first one, do no harm. Because as you start to walk that level of excellence, depending on what level, you know, when you're starting to talk about national caliber, Olympic caliber, professional caliber athletes, there tends to be a fine line of how hard to push that body to get to that point. In fact, there's a lot of discussion about that in the gymnastics world right now, is where do you draw the line where abuse occurs, physical abuse on your body, and everybody's different. You know, what I can handle physically may be a little different than what my next door neighbor can handle physically. So it's a tough thing to walk when you start to go up that ladder. So that's where, you know, obviously 100%, you cannot do harm. It was a big thing with me, and it bothered me as a gymnastics coach sometimes to see coaches in that field having their athletes compete skills that I knew, watching them compete them, they weren't ready to compete, to do well. So now the risk of injury goes up, and I was like, you know, to me, no gymnast in my gym ever threw something they could not consistently do safely in practice. You know, I want to do this big move for the state championship. Can you do it in practice? No.
Yeah, right. Can you do it, you know, under pressure in practice? You know, on a bad day, can you pull it off?
That's right. So to me, you know, I would put things out there. Well, you've got to hit it 5 times in a row. You have to do this routine and then hit 5 times in a row. And what you mentioned right there was a big thing for me too, is you make practice harder actually than the competition, and the competition then becomes easy.
Nice.
Yeah. What I think we'll do the bio in part 2, because I think we're on a good roll here on the coaching. I was talking to someone the other day about the Soviets in the 60s and 70s when I was a youngster, and I'm thinking, okay, you're building an elite athlete, and they're living away from their family in these education camps, and the pressure's on, and there may be performance enhancing substances, what have you, and I'm trying to think of how they were so good at performing under pressure as compared to the Westerners, Americans and the Canadians, what have you. And the only thing I could come up with is that they closed down the emotion more because of their culture. Even if they were living at home, maybe their culture was less expressive, the Soviet and the Russian culture. And then number 2 is they were trained to close that down. So a lot of times if you see their coaches, you don't see the Bella Caroli hugging, smiley, mustachioed guy. You see these more stone-faced, like the female coaches with the makeup galore and the hair and the stern look back in the 70s. It's a completely different look than you might find in like the parents of the coaches in America who are picking up their kids from practice and then going to the mall and having an ice cream. So it's this fun, expressive type of thing. And maybe you can share your point of view on why you think those Soviet athletes were so good in performance competitions.
Well, I think
Hi, this is Sifu Slim, author of The Aging Athlete. In this book, you're going to get to hear about two different groups of former high-performance athletes. One group, which is made up of 90% of the former athletes, does not do physical activity on a regular basis and tends to suffer the consequences of a sedentary lifestyle. The other group, which is made up of 10% of the former athletes, is doing physical activity on a regular basis and tends to thrive through the aging process, or at least has a better chance at coping with the aging process. We could have taken these folks to a lab and done all kinds of tests on them. Instead, we slowed them down and sat them down and asked them, in their own words, to describe why they're wired the way they are, so that we all, former athletes and non-athletes, can use some of their inspirational and motivational and mindset lessons in our own lives. I hope you pick up a copy today. You can go to theagingathlete.com. And when you have a chance to read it, I'd love to hear back from you to find out what your thoughts are on the stories of these aging athletes.
Performance competitions.
Well, I think you hit on one thing, and that was the culture is different, Sifu. It's just a different culture. It's like comparing us to Japan. You know, Japan is a very disciplined culture. East Bloc was very different. And I'll add something to that. I think there was a lot of fear involved. You know, and some of that was brought, you know, Caroli brought some of that. There's arguments and discussions in the gymnastics world right now with regard to that. And the scandal with Nasser, I'm not sure you're familiar with.
Yeah, the doctor, yeah.
All of that. So the problem is that will work. See, that's where I come from. It's not that it won't work. It works. How do I know that? Look at the decades that the East Bloc countries did dominating. So it works. My question is there a better way?
Yeah.
And so that's where I come from. Because I would prefer, as a coach, as a person, and as a parent, for my athletes, for my kids to be intrinsically motivated. So I want to put in those kind of efforts like they did because I want to do that, not because you're making me do that. Both systems work. I think one is more beneficial for the individual, the one that it comes from inside. And that was my experience as an athlete. It came from inside. So from the sense that that's one of the reasons why they're so good, because fear does work. I mean, you can be made to do something and you can do it repeatedly to a point where you slowly climb that ladder of excellence. My point would be, I believe there's a better way.
Yeah, I for years talked about how my father's generation, and probably my grandfather's too, fighting it out on the East Coast. Chicago area would have been no different. The meatpacking plants and, you know, 15 different nationalities fighting it out for jobs, many of them illiterate. And they often stuffed emotions. So you have in the modern era this whole idea of letting out your emotions, catharsis, small group meetings, team building at work, etc. So you're supposed to let it out. But I think the survival mechanism of my dad's generation, it actually worked. As horrible as that sounds on a psychological therapeutic level, his generation that stuffed emotions were so productive and so ingrained on work and family and going to church perhaps on the weekend that they got a lot done, and they didn't get divorced and they didn't get over emotional where they had to do all of this touchy-feely stuff all the time, which I think it's good to do some of the time, but maybe not as much as to be a drama infused like we see so much today with our young people. And even the school district where you worked, it'd be fun to know what the difference in drama was between the 1920s through 50s, 50s through 70s, and then the free expression of the 70s and beyond. It'd be fun to see what that was.
I think you bring some very interesting points to the discussion. For some reason, we live in a society of extremes. You know, what and the pendulum. And I say this a lot to people. You know, there's got to be a balance somewhere in the middle. I mean, there are things from past generations that we should try to copy and emulate. They were good. They did some good things. There are some things from currently that are also very good. I am upset a little bit of the extremes that I see on both ends. It's either this way or that way. Well, no, there's got to be a balance in there. So I think that speaks a little bit to what it is you're talking about.
PCES. Do you want to speak a bit about that and what that means and where you learned about that?
Well, I gotta be, for me now. Again, I'm retired, so I stopped teaching in 2013. I actually stopped coaching as a head coach in '92, and assistants in volleyball like the late '90s. So PCES, that's Personal Code of Ethical Standards. For me, it's not something I ever really used because it was automatically part of my coaching. Yeah, I mean, when I emphasized character a lot when I coached. Character was a big deal to me. So that comes with integrity. It comes from having high expectations of behavior, whether it's coming into practice on time, the amount of repetitions you do, the expectation of how those reps have to be done, many, many different areas. Holding kids accountable. What other things are involved there? Oh, setting a good example. I mean, I was a firm believer that if I'm going to expect my kids to do these things, I'm going to do it twice as good or work twice as hard, so they can always say, "Well, he's doing that. We need to follow that along." So, setting a good example, and then looking at kids not just for what they are in the gym. That goes back to that thing I mentioned about that conversation with that other club coach. That they're more than just robots in a gym. So that was my whole idea of that. I'm teaching gymnastics and excellence in that, how far you can go, but the main objective is to teach you about life. So the PCES, which came more into existence, I'm going to guess somewhere in the early 2000s, as far as a acronym and a term. In high schools, I have never known a high school to not have an athletic code. Are you familiar with the term athletic codes?
Tell me what you mean, athletic coach.
Codes, athletic codes.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so every athlete in my high school, and every high school I've ever known, has to go. Well, they're supposed to bring it to their parents, and they have to sign it every year. Some schools do it a year, and it's good for the 4 years. And in that, that's your PC, your Personal Code of Ethical Standard, because it talks about drinking and drugs and refraining from that. It talks about sportsmanship, which is another big piece. It talks about attitude and grades. I mean, the whole gamut. And every athlete is to sign that, and their parents are to sign that. Now, over time, what my experience is with athletes is that was just something they took, signed, and then brought back to school so they could compete. My kids, they brought theirs home. We sat at a dinner table. We both read it. And my explanation to them was very simple. Look, you don't have to be an athlete. You don't have. This is a choice you make. When you make that choice, my signature and your signature means that you're abiding by these rules. To not do so, to sign something, any contract, I don't care if it's for your house, for a mortgage, it doesn't matter. When you put your name on something, that should mean something to you. So it says something about your character. And the times that's going to be tested as a high school athlete are going to be numerous. So you have to sit back and say to yourself, what does this mean to me? Now, it's going to be tough. Peer pressure is there. There's going to be kids that are going to want you to break these rules. I can guarantee you, as I did with them, and I spoke about this with my athletes as well, that if you follow these rules, what it builds on the inside is a type of strength and grit that a lot of people don't experience. So the benefits are unseen, but they're there inside of you, which help in aspects of life. So when you ask me about PCES, I look at it and say, well, to me, it's just part of how I coached and how I brought up my kids.
Perfect. Somebody shared with me that, people can live how they want to live. They can do what they want. And I said, that's completely an aberrant statement. If you look at the history of the hunter-gatherers, millions of years, they've got their routine. And if they do the routine and they master living amongst each other and living in the wild and finding food, water, shelter, and surviving against the antagonistic tribe, then they've mastered it. So there's a contract, in my opinion, when you were born on this planet that you have to sign. And it goes back to doing the right thing, doing no harm, etc. But the social contract, I think, rejects the idea that we can do whatever we want. So I think, having a PE coach when I was a kid who was a lot bigger and stronger and often sterner than my dad, very frequently, that's what a lot of the coaches were like, especially the football coaches. I thought that was a good thing for me to be around, because the sternness wasn't necessarily fear. There was fear involved, but it was more like, hey, this person means business, and I'm going to respect that. It was like drawing respect from me, the young kid who maybe wanted to test some limits.
Well, I actually brought a lot of that into my classroom as well. I was known as a pretty strict teacher and pretty strict coach, but there was always that piece that I tried to connect from the idea, I'm doing this way because I care about you.
Yeah.
I care about what happens to you. This goes beyond my classroom in physical education or my health classroom or my coaching field. So that, I think, is an important piece to all that you just talked about.
Yeah, fantastic. So your book, Becoming a True Champion, I added "for life" on the end of it for the interview's sake, because we're talking about a long period of time. Is that available on the internet? And tell the viewers how they can get a copy.
Well, Becoming a True Champion is actually available at any bookseller. I had the choice of self-publishing or a more difficult path, which was traditional publishing, which is, I learned so much going through that. I had no idea the difficulty of going that way. And based on what I was trying to do, I ended up taking that route with the added incentive that a friend of mine who was in the publishing industry told me that would be impossible because my platform wasn't big enough. So typically my nature is, oh, that's impossible. That's what I'm going to do, because to me, impossibility is a state of mind. So that getting back to your question, you can purchase it pretty much anywhere. If you go to a Barnes & Noble, a bookstore, and they don't have it, they'll order it for you. So whether it's Amazon, whether it's Roman and Littlefield, which is my publisher, or whether it's a bookseller anywhere, it can be purchased.
Fantastic. So wind that down. I'm Sifu Slim with Kirk Mango, coach, Naperville, Illinois, retired, and still actively pursuing balance and daily physical activity and learning. So that's a nice thing. So we'll come back with part 2 in just a minute. Sifu Slim, theagingathlete.com. Please give us a thumbs up, like, and please subscribe to the channel and share a comment, a respectful comment if you care to do so. And we'll try to get back to you with an answer relevant to that. And we'll be back in just a moment.